ANC ministers.
The same ANC ministers.
Public enterprises all along.
Yes. There was the president at the time. It wasn't Zuma. There was a minister at the time. It wasn't any minister that ututamaziyo noma close again. Coleman Andrews came in. Wafike wenza. Actually, he killed the company. Why qeda company?
Continent. South African Airways was the biggest on the continent. And South African Airways was being managed by white people like Coleman Andrews from the United States of America. And that man destroyed South African Airways from being the biggest airliner on the African continent to having 12 aircraft.
I got a call on Christmas Eve as I was driving to a dinner in Virginia from the representative of the South African government describing to me that they were in the middle of a global search for a CEO to turn around their principal national asset and then to privatize it.
Well, you can't really get much higher in terms of human capital than South Africa's former president,
Absolutely not.
Nelson Mandela, and Nobel Prize winner as well. Now, you joined him in the late 90s to help turn around South African Airways, which was facing several challenges at the time. How did that happen?
As a South African, you remember
know,
that
yeah.
well, yeah. And at the end of the conversation, which stretched on for about a half an hour, I remember hanging up and thinking this could be an extraordinary possibility, a complicated, fascinating strategy challenge, and doing that while working under the tutelage of one of my great heroes, Nelson Mandela.
Buckle up, folks, because this is the story of South African Airways, or SAA, and its CEO, Coleman Andrews. Imagine a company bleeding money faster than a budget airline on a fuel efficiency test. That was SAA in the late 90s. Enter Andrews in 1998, a supposed airline savior with a southern drawl smoother than a first-class landing. Hopes were high. Could he turn this financial nosedive into a graceful ascent? Spoiler alert, things get turbulent. Andrews, with his impressive resume and promises of a brighter future, was tasked with pulling SAA out of its financial tailspin. The government, eager for a turnaround, pinned their hopes on his leadership. The stage was set for a dramatic corporate turnaround, but as we all know, things rarely go according to plan. Andrews' early days were marked by bold moves, including a partial sale of SAA to Swissair. This move, while controversial, was hailed by some as a necessary step to inject much-needed capital into the struggling airline. However, it also set the stage for conflicts over control and decision-making. Little did anyone know that this seemingly positive start would quickly descend into a maelstrom of accusations, financial irregularities, and industrial unrest. This, my friends, is the story of how SAA's attempted turnaround took a nosedive, leaving a trail of controversy in its wake. Fast forward to October 2000 and Andrews dropped a bombshell. He offered to resign. Now, CEOs don't usually offer to quit unless things are going about as smoothly as a water landing with a flock of geese on the runway. Andrews was frustrated, claiming constant meddling from the South African government and its transport arm Transnet. According to Andrews, the government's constant interference was like trying to fly a plane with someone in the cockpit yelling contradictory instructions. He claimed their interference was stifling his efforts to restructure and revitalize the airline. But was this a legitimate gripe, or a convenient excuse for a CEO feeling the heat? Adding fuel to the fire were accusations of slander and, wait for it, fraud. That's right, folks. Andrews claimed some higher-ups were throwing around accusations of financial impropriety. This wasn't just a boardroom squabble. This was getting personal. The once promising CEO was now embroiled in a bitter battle with his political masters. The honeymoon phase was well and truly over, and the fight for control of SAA was on. Was Andrews a victim of political maneuvering, or was there more to these accusations than met the eye? One of Andrews' main complaints was the alleged meddling in SAA's corporate governance. According to him, Transnet and government officials were like that annoying backseat driver who keeps grabbing the steering wheel at the worst possible moments. Andrews pointed to instances where key decisions were allegedly overruled or influenced by political agendas, undermining his authority and hindering his turnaround strategy. The lines between government oversight and outright interference seemed blurred at best. This raised serious questions about the government's role in state-owned enterprises. Were they acting as responsible stewards of taxpayer money, or using SAA as a political football? The accusations of political interference painted a picture of an airline caught in a tug-of-war between the government's desire for control and the CEO's vision for the company. This battle for control played out in the boardroom, and the media had serious implications for SAA's future. Now let's talk money, shall we? One of the biggest bones of contention during Andrews' tenure was the hefty sum shelled out to consultants. A whopping R218, $9 million. To put that into perspective, you could buy a whole fleet of those tiny toy airplanes they give you in first class with that kind of cash. Andrews defended the expenditure, arguing that these consultants were essential to his restructuring efforts. He claimed they brought invaluable expertise and helped achieve a significant improvement in SAA's operating profit, a cool $660 million. However, critics cried foul, arguing that these consultants were overpaid and unnecessary. They questioned whether their contributions justified the exorbitant fees. The optics of a struggling airline spending millions on consultants while shedding jobs didn't exactly inspire confidence. Then there was Andrews' own compensation package, which totaled a cool $232, $2 million during his time at the helm. Now we all know CEOs get paid handsomely, but this raised eyebrows even amongst the most generous shareholders. The combination of high consultant fees and Andrews' own generous remuneration package fueled accusations of lavish spending and a disconnect from the realities of a struggling airline. Section 5. A different tune. Satawu's criticism and allegations of mismanagement. But it wasn't just the government and the media questioning Andrews' leadership. The South African Transport and Allied Workers Union, or SATAWU, representing many SAA employees, had some choice words for the CEO. They weren't exactly singing his praises, let's just say that. SATAWU argued that Andrews' claims of financial success were misleading. They pointed to SAA's 51 million rand profit in 1999, claiming it resulted from asset stripping, layoffs, and outsourcing, not sound management. In their view, Andrews was cutting his way to profitability, leaving a trail of disgruntled workers in his wake. Furthermore, SATAWU alleged that Andrews had orchestrated the dismissal of over 25 black managers as part of his restructuring efforts. They claimed these dismissals were unfair and racially motivated, further fueling tensions between management and the workforce. SATAWU also alleged that SAA had paid out over 20 million rand in unfair dismissal suits during Andrews' tenure. This, they argued, was further evidence of his mismanagement and disregard for the rights of workers. SATAWU's criticisms painted a starkly different picture of Andrews' leadership. While he touted financial improvements, they saw a CEO who prioritized profits over people, leaving a trail of job losses and resentment. Section 6. Turbulence in the ranks, industrial disputes, and financial fallout. As if the political pressure and accusations of financial impropriety weren't enough, Andrews also faced a series of crippling industrial disputes. It seems the workers, represented by SATAWU, weren't too keen on his cost-cutting measures, particularly when it came to their jobs and working conditions. One particularly nasty dispute involved the retrenchment of 94 cargo workers. These workers were laid off as part of Andrews' restructuring plan, but the move backfired spectacularly when SATAWU took up their cause. The ensuing legal battle cost SAA over 2 million rand in settlement fees. Then there was the case of the 42 cabin crew members who were dismissed under questionable circumstances. Again, SATAWU fought tooth and nail for their reinstatement, and SAA eventually caved, costing the airline over 10 million rand in back pay and legal fees. Ouch! These industrial disputes weren't just bad for morale, they were a financial drain on an already struggling airline. Every rand spent on legal battles and settlements was money that couldn't be used to improve services or invest in the future. The constant labor unrest highlighted the deep divisions between management and the workforce. Andrews' efforts to streamline operations and cut costs had created a climate of fear and resentment. leading to costly and damaging industrial action. Section 7, Ministerial Intervention, Promises of Action and Shifting Blame. With SAA embroiled in controversy and facing mounting financial losses, it was only a matter of time before the government stepped in. Enter Jeff Radebe, the Minister of Public Enterprises, who promised a thorough investigation into the allegations of mismanagement and improper conduct at the airline. Radebe didn't mince words, vowing to hold those responsible accountable for any wrongdoing. He acknowledged the seriousness of the situation, promising swift and decisive action to restore public confidence in the national carrier. However, in a move that surprised few, Radebe also pointed the finger at Saki Makazoma, his predecessor, blaming him for Andrews's exorbitant salary and the hefty consultant fees. This, he argued, had created a culture of lavish spending at SAA. Radebe's intervention, while welcomed by some, also raised eyebrows. Critics saw it as an attempt to shift blame and deflect attention away from the government's own role in SAA's woes. They argued that the government couldn't simply wash its hands of responsibility for the mess at the airline. The ministerial intervention, while promising action and accountability, also highlighted the political maneuvering and blame games that often plagued state-owned enterprises. Section 8, Contrasting Narratives, a tale of two SAAs. So, who was right? Was Coleman Andrews a visionary leader who faced unfair obstacles, or was he a reckless CEO whose tenure was marked by mismanagement and disregard for workers' rights? However, his critics, including Satawu, painted a very different picture. They argued that his cost-cutting measures came at the expense of workers' jobs and livelihoods. They accused him of prioritizing profits over people, leading to a toxic work environment and damaging industrial disputes. The accusations of lavish spending on consultants and his own generous remuneration package further fueled the perception that he was out of touch with the realities of a struggling airline.
You really have a long record of service. Why is this such a passion for you?
You know, for a number of the years of my life, I think my focus was primarily on achieving things and to some degree accumulating wealth.
I-issue ye-corruption eka-SAA on ama-losses aka-SAA uqinisile it predates i-term yami. Kukhona nje udokotela owayumlungu owayu-chairman laphaya kwaba nama-losses of over 5 billion on, in fact 15 billion to be precise, on ama-hedging losses. Akazazabiza ukuthiwa kayo account. Asibuyele emuva, ubaba uMacozoma waye u-chairman we-board. Ngaphansi kwakhe kwakukhona u-CEO wayelandwe eAmerica. Again, we've got to start believing in our own homegrown timber. Asibeliveni kubantu bethu base South Africa. Kwalandwa i-specialist ekwathiwa i-aviation expert yalandwa eAmerica. Kwathiwa izothena i-airline around. Yafike yenzani? Esikhundleni sokuthi yenze ama strategies ke njenge expert azokwazi ukuthi a reduce ama losses within the company. Wathatha indlu le yahlala kuyona wayidayisa. Kade i-paid up waseyayirenta akasenayo imali yokuthenga igrocery ngaphakathi. In other words, wathatha amabhanoyi wonke aka-SAA akade ekhona u-SAA awathengelwa yi-state for free e-paid up wayewadayisa. Uma sewadayisile wawalisa back. Uma sesenza indaba yakwa-SAA khona othengi ngathengi ngithembisa kanje. Uma sesenza indaba anongibuza ukuthi obani laba okwathi mayisedayisiwe lamabhanoyi ase eyaliswa back to SAA kwaba yibona abawathengile.
Obani bona lapho?
Anongibuza.
We're asking you now.
And ningibuze
sifisa ukwazi manje obani.
Niphinde futhi ningibuza ukuthi imalini le ibhanoyi phela lifana nemoto. It wears off. In other words, liya ngokuguga phela. Kodwa thina usakhokha iprice yebhanoyi as though lilizwa namhlanje lalilizwe ngo-2001
yes,
by Coleman Andrews. Akekho noyedwa umuntu omnyama eSouth Africa oke wasukuma wathi ake nibize uColeman Andrews eAmerica ezela owathi mayefike eSAA wazi wathatha ngisho i-consulting firm ikankosikazi wakhe wayiqasha khona kwa-SAA, wathengelwa nendlu, wanikezwa ama-shares kwa-SAA. Ngiphume kwa-SAA ngibuka ukuthi le nkampani le can be turned around into profitability.
Here's a question then. The organization run South Africa now from 94 and during its is the same ANC that is leading njengamanje. Are they blind kuzo zonke lezi zinto oyishoyo ekutheni why not take a South African uzothatha Coleman Andrews ukufaka kwa SAA phansi kwa Transnet nemotivation yokubakhipha and all the things oyishoyo? You are umuntu we-ANC yourself. Ithini ngoba i-ANC yona ethatha ama decisions as the party governing the country?
I-process of hiring u-CEO squarely depends on uminister. Nina, as the board, you advertise, you interview people, you submit 3 names. But chairman no minister, they sit and discuss these names. Minister can overrule the process. I don't think kulaba abalapha mgwami one fits the criteria that we want or our requirements ala SAA. Perhaps let's get an expert somewhere else. And the minister, in consultation with the board, can make that recommendation.
But the same ANC ministers.
The same ANC ministers.
Public enterprises all along. Yes.
There was the president at the time. It wasn't Zuma. There was a minister at the time. It wasn't any minister that ututamaziyo noma close again. Coleman Andrews came in. Wafige wenza. Actually, he killed the company. Why qeda company?
Chair, I would first like to talk generally about the financials of SAA. I had an opportunity of looking at the financials for 18 years, from 2000 up to 2017. I wanted to go further to 2018, 19, 20 March, and I requested those financials, but I understand they are not yet available. But I want to bring it to the attention of the South Africans that since 2000, the year that I started to review the financial statements, there is not a single year from 2000 up to 2017. There is not a single year that SAA incurred operating profits. What I mean by operating profits, I mean where the revenue of SAA is enough to cover the expenses of SAA without selling any other item. We all know that in 2000, 2001, all the fleet of SAA was sold to finance operating activities. We all know the story of Coleman Andrews, that he went away with 250 million golden handshake, despite the fact that SAA never incurred any profits from 2000 up to 2017. And I'm sure even the financials of 2018 that are not yet out will also show exactly the same thing.
It was a standard way of privatizing something. Like when Margaret Thatcher wanted to privatize the British railroads, the technique was defund them. And then when they don't work, people get angry. They say, let's do something. So you hand it over to private enterprise, which totally ruins them, and then the state has to come back in, big cost, and try to reconstruct it somehow. It's known as privatization.
So behind me is one of the most successful stories and the most inspirational stories in Africa. And that story is Ethiopian Airways. I'm sitting at Bole International Airport. It's owned by Ethiopian Airways, and Ethiopian Airways is owned by the government of Ethiopia, and it is funded by the Sovereign Wealth Fund of Ethiopia. Now, you need to understand that Ethiopia has never been colonized by white people. So this airline was created by black people, a black government in 1945, and it was grown from nothing to become the biggest airliner on the African continent. It has revenues of 7.2 billion US dollars and a profit of 800 million US dollars. They've got 149 aircraft. They own Malawi Airlines, Zambian Airlines, and a number of other airlines on the African continent. But just 15 years ago, this airline was not the biggest on the African continent. South African Airways was the biggest on the continent. And South African Airways was being managed by white people like Coleman Andrews from the United States of America. And that man destroyed South African Airways from being the biggest airliner on the African continent to having 12 aircraft, 80 million US dollars revenue, and a loss of 200 million US dollars in the last financial year. The financing model for South African Airways is it's owned by the government of South Africa, which is funded by white monopoly capital because South Africa does not have a sovereign wealth fund. So part and parcel of why South African Airlines was destroyed is because a white man called Coleman Andrews from the United States of America came in, sold South African Airways fleet, began to lease aircraft from America, and he pocketed a lot of money in kickbacks from that corruption. South Africa does not have a sovereign wealth fund, so it does not finance its own activities. It relies on white monopoly capital to borrow money so that it can keep its parastatals going. Ethiopia, on the other hand, finances its parastatals, finances its SOEs with the sovereign wealth of its own citizens. This is the difference. South Africa is being looted by white monopoly capital, white finance, white banks that then lend the government of South Africa exorbitantly at high interest rates. And when they choose, like what Future Growth decided to do together with other finances, they just decide not to lend the government so that SOEs like Eskom, SAA, PRASA, Transnet can fail. The Ethiopians are using a totally different model because they've never been colonized. They do not have financial institutions from white countries or Western countries. They've only got local banks in this country and its sovereign wealth fund. They're able to finance their parastatals and their airliner to become the best in Africa. Managed by black people into being the biggest on the African continent. This shows you that we don't need white people in Africa to do things for us. They've also done the same with electricity. They didn't have an electricity grid just 30 years ago, while South Africa had a surplus of electricity. But now Ethiopia is a net exporter of electricity, and they've never had load shedding since they began to develop their grid. Inga Dam is going to come into full capacity, and they'll have more than enough electricity than they need. Again, done by black people, while South Africa, run by white monopoly capital, is failing. Black excellence always beats white people in Africa and elsewhere. The Swiss do not have a national airliner, or at least it failed a number of times. Together with a number of other European countries, Ethiopian Airlines has been going, it's profitable, it's a going concern. Learn something from this, South Africa. Now you're giving your spazas to Pick and Pay, you're giving your spazas over to ShopRite. White people cannot manage your country better than yourselves, because their only objective is to destroy, monopolize, and kill. It is to control black people. It is to destroy what black people build. It's to show that black people don't know what they're doing. But I'm showing you an example that shows you that black people do better than white people. This is an example. A country that's never been colonized, but a country that was also isolated by colonialism of other African countries. But within 60 years, they're doing better than many European airlines. They're doing better than many European countries that are 200, 300 years old. Learn from this. Learn from this, Africa, and stop sleeping.
The most important person in the world is the storyteller. The storyteller sets the vision, values, and agenda of an entire generation to come. Steve Jobs.